Hello, Mr. Spall. I'm Henri.
Henri, nice to meet you.
Same here. Hello, how are you? Good to see you.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
All right, well, photographers are at it for a few extra seconds. I'd like to remind you that the press conference will start momentarily, that if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand a little bit ahead of time so that I can see you. And more importantly, so that the ladies going up and down the aisle can get to you, give you the microphone. When you have the microphone, please stand up, introduce yourselves, ask the question, and then give the mic back. Thank you very much. Okay, and please turn your cell phones off, iPads, and all those things. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the press conference for Mr. Turner. And I will start from the very end of the table, from me, anyway. She's worked with this director quite a number of times, particularly on Vera Drake and on Topsy Turvy, Miss Georgina Lowe. Sitting next to her, cinematographer Dick Pope. Now come to my side as Hannah Danby, Miss Dorothy Atkinson. Skip one as Sophia Booth, Miss Marion Bailey. The towering gentleman in the middle is Mr. Turner, Timothy Spall. And the bearded one is director Mike Leigh. And we will have the first question here, the second question there. Le micro ici, s'il vous plaît. Merci. And the third one there.
Hello, Hugh Dyer, Belgian TV. Thank you for this brilliant movie. It's a question for Mike Leigh and for Timothy Spall. Very simple question, of course. Why did you feel, Mr. Leigh, you can do a movie about this part of the life of Turner? Or why did you have images in mind? And Mr. Spall, how to play a painter, or how to paint without to be ridiculous? Thank you.
I suppose your question is why make the film at all? And Turner is a great, obviously a great artist, one of the great painters of all time anywhere, really, a great radical revolutionary painter. I felt it would be, there was scope for what could be a fascinating film because of what for me seemed the tension between this very mortal, in some ways flawed and a very inspired individual, and this epic work and this spiritual way that he had of distilling and capturing and expressing the world. You ask about images. I mean, the central images that we could only have are the images which are the inspiration from looking at his paintings, and that's something that we shared very much in our conception of the film. As to the character, well, over to you, Tim.
Well, about 3 years ago, I was walking down Greek Street, where Mike's office is in Soho, and he'd spoken to me about 3 years before and said he had this idea, don't tell anybody he was going to make a film about Turner. And he said, right. No, I was walking. Now I phoned him up, and I was sitting under Turner's house in Maiden Lane. And I phoned him up and didn't get an answer. He phoned me back later. He said, right, come into the office. What are you doing? He said, right, we're going to make this film in 3 years' time, 2.5 years' time. I'd like you to start painting. So I started to learn how to paint 2 years before I started rehearsing. And then we rehearsed 6 months. A brilliant English portrait painter called Tim Wright gave me lessons when I wasn't working. Every time I wasn't working, I'd see him 2-3 times a week. He lived very close to me. So on a practical level, I prepared. And then, obviously, I researched a lot. And then the great thing is, I knew a little bit about Turner. The great thing is that what made us the perfect match, apart from anything, is he was a funny-looking, fat little man, and so am I. But as far as his soul was concerned, that took a lot of research, and his art and what his inspirations were, and that is part of the process of working with Mike and the other cast.
Call me ignorant. I was not aware I did not know there was so much to Turner's personal life. I did not know that he was that voracious man on all fronts. Is that something new discovery? Was it already on public place?
Well, he was a man of mystery, and there are quite a few biographies, and I read quite a few. I mean, it became obvious that he was, and I think to me, what makes the film so wonderful to me is that it's about how genius is not always in the most romantic of packages. How most geniuses are strange. They do have conflict. They do have these conflicts in themselves. They are often odd-looking, sociopaths, you know. Sometimes they're charming. This man, we found out, was kind of simian. He was kind of ape-like in a sense. He was working class, but he had this amazing soul, this poetic soul. He was an autodidact, but then he had the opportunity to synthesize and assimilate all this genius that was around him. You know, he was a great fan of Claude Lorrain's Titian's. He absorbed all these people. So this contradiction between this slightly brutish, but you know, a man with love in his heart, but not quite sure where to put it, and this amazing visual genius that he has was quite a very interesting thing to investigate.
Question here, then the lady.
Good morning, Yishun Kang from Sina.com. So first of all, congratulations for the great performances, appealing dialogues. So I got a question for Mr. Lee, please. So in your earlier works, you normally didn't have scripts at the very beginning, and you developed the plot and dialogues with the characters within the rehearsals, and recorded them as the screenplay, and you made the films strictly according to the screenplay. But this time, Mr. Turner, he was a historical figure. He's a real person, and I heard that you tried really hard to try to re-establish the scenes at that era by studying his paintings.
Say the last thing again.
You spent lots of time and tried really hard to re-establish the scenes from his era by studying his paintings. So it seems to me that the freedom of improvisation was much less than earlier. How did this work out? Did you still give the freedom of within the rehearsals to your actors as earlier? Thank you.
This film is actually no different from any of my other films. If you remember, we made a film 15 years ago called Topsy Turvy, which was about the Victorian theatre. And that has in common with this film, of course, that we were dramatising historical characters, and the job was to bring to life that world in a poetic and free, and not in a documentary way, but still in a way with the responsibility to create a reality that was properly grounded in the research. You can read all the books in the world, you can research for 1 million years, but it doesn't make things happen in front of the camera. It doesn't make Turner happen in front of the camera. You still have to create a characterization. We still have to breathe flesh and blood into it. So what we did is exactly what we always do, which is to create these characters to work and to develop the whole world of the film. But added to that was all the research that informed our decisions. But in the end, you still have to kind of make it happen. And there was no script, as always.
Karen Batt for the Huffington Post. A question for Mr. Lee and for Mr. Pope afterwards. For Mr. Lee, since this is a movie about an artist made by an artist, I can't help thinking, is there any way you connect to the character, for example, any traits that he has, his obsession with sketching, and also, in conjunction with the question just asked before, how do you define spiritual? How did you see him as spiritual? How do you define it? And if it might inspire death, I also saw a lot of issues with death and sickness as much as spiritual. So those were my questions. And for Mr. Pope, you had a big challenge to recreate this.
Take it one step
Yeah,
at a time?
yes, let me answer your question, and he won't escape.
Okay.
He'll try, but you know, I've been asked a number of times, though you're not quite asking me this, whether this film is in some way an autobiography. It isn't. But on the other hand, I mean, two things are very clear and non-negotiable. One is that whatever one makes a film about, whoever the characters, for me, the kind of films that I'm concerned with, it has to come from an empathy, an understanding of the characters, whoever they are, whatever they are. And the second thing is that, of course, you know, we are artists, therefore we do naturally understand the territory that we're making a film about. But that isn't the same thing as it being a kind of narcissistic investigation of ourselves. No. With respect, I think the question, I've been asked a number of tough questions at press conferences at Cannes, but how do I define spiritual is the hardest I've heard so far. I mean, you know, Turner paints, you could say a painter paints what he sees. Turner stands on a cliff top and he paints the seascape, he paints the sky, you know, and we know that there are infinite numbers of people who paint pictures of what they see, who put down what they see and record it in what you could call a photographic way. We know that when Turner does that, he sees beyond the sea and the sky. He brings to it an experience and shares with us and makes us see an experience that goes beyond the surface. And that is about the whole thing of living and, as you say, dying and life, what life is about. And I guess not wanting to degenerate into being pretentious, that is what I would mean and understand by spiritual.
Could I just add a little thing to that? Turner was what we call very much in the centre a painter of the sublime. Not in the word we use, the way we use it now, like sublime, you know, like the sublime meant the tension between man's involvement in the beauty and the horror of nature, the beauty and the horror of the nature, and the horror in the beauty of nature. And that was very much something, it grew out of the romantic painters, not again a word that has come to mean something else. A romantic painter was very much what Mike said. The romantic painters were the first painters who painted what they felt about what they saw, not what they saw. So coming from the romantic into sublime, the sublime is about horror and beauty and man's futility within it. And that is what Turner was trying to record from his very, very guts.
And the question to Mr. Pope?
It must be a big challenge to recreate in your shots the beauty of an artist like Turner. And if you could say a few words about your choices and how it was beautiful to watch these scenes.
Well, the choices started off with me researching the palette that Turner used in his paintings, and it's on public display actually at Tate Britain, including his colours on his colours, the way he used them are all documented there. So I started by researching the colours that he actually used for the paintings, and then we devised a palette ourselves based on that. So that was the only real rigorous choices that I made, was to try and tell the story with the pictures, with the colours that he used at that time.
I think it would be true to say, wouldn't it, that, and this applies to what we've all done on this film, is that when you really start to really research something and really investigate it, and go into it on all kinds of levels and at all kinds of depths, then it gets into your bloodstream. It gets into your psyche in some way, and that informs, so that we made decisions which, by the time we made the film, having prepared, we weren't necessarily consciously actually saying this is that painting or this is, it was there, as I say, in our bloodstream, because that's the name of the job, really, is to kind of embrace it and absorb it, and then to allow our creative subconscious to inform the decisions we make.
I had been in that process of in that world for a long time, because Mike and I talked about the film for many years before we made it. So by the time we hit it, I was, very well grounded in the work and the research, for the nuts and bolts of photography. But we had talked and talked endlessly about making this film for many years, and so it was a project of love.
Question here, then here, then here.
Good morning, Peter Hull from the Toronto Star. Congratulations on the film. Question for Mike Lee. Mr. Lee, I noticed that your Palm winner, Secrets and Lies, was going to be a stamp for the Royal Mail. Do you take that as a good omen for the Palme d'Or with Mr. Turner? And also, does this now elevate you to the status of British icon, or were you there already?
Well, it's nice to have two silly questions at this stage. I mean, it's great. It's great that Secrets and Lies is on a stamp. It's unfortunately on a stamp that's more expensive than the one I normally use when I send a letter. They asked me for a quotation, the Royal Mail publicity people. They said, "Can we have a quotation to go with, so that we can sell it?" And I said, and I thought, well, I don't know what you say. So the quotation is, I hope that that nobody that ever uses this stamp should forget about the thousands of babies that are given away for adoption every year. Because, in the end, the film is about something and about something important, and I thought that maybe people should be reminded of that. What was your other, something to do with icons or something? What?
Are you there? An icon already?
Make you an official British icon now, or were you already a British icon? Does this elevate you to that status, or maybe the same status as Mr. Turner?
I hope as a profoundly iconoclastic person, I will resist the temptation to be an icon that you are suggesting I might be seduced into indulging myself with.
I think being an icon is a bit like being accused of being eccentric. You don't know if you're eccentric.
I think I know, and as indeed you do, we're more aware of being eccentrics than we are of being icons.
I think I'd take the eccentric.
Question over there, then here. Who has the mic? Go ahead.
I'm here. Hello, Jan Lumholt from Svenska Dagbladet in Stockholm. Quick question for Mr. Pope and then for Mr. Lee. As far as creating the kind of Turner-esque imagery, are you aware of a film called Father and Son made by Alexander Sokurov a couple of years ago? Because this film was deliberately inspired only by Turner's paintings.
Which film? Our film?
No,
A film called Father and
yeah,
Son.
Father and Son.
This Sokurov film. Are you aware of it?
Yes. Yes. Aware of it? Yes, I've seen it.
Did you steal
Yes,
from it?
and what do you want us to do about it?
No, I just wonder if it inspired you in any way.
No, not at all. In fact, I'd forgotten about it until we'd made the film, and then somebody reminded me. Really.
The other question regards the fact that you sometimes do these portraits, like of Gilbert and Sullivan in Topsy Turvy, of Turner in Mr. Turner. Do you feel now and then that you is that a side of you that I feel that these films are a little different from, I don't know, Happy Go Lucky or Another Year? Do you feel that sometimes you have to, you would like to do these portraits, and also is it more difficult to realize them, to finance them, and so forth?
I don't think anything is any less difficult than anything else. I mean, all these films are tough to make because you try and really get down to the hard rock of life. You can look at my films, and you could say there's lots of filmmakers, but certainly look at my films, and on one level, I would suggest you can see a consistency going through all the films. They have an imprimatur, if you like, and a style and some preoccupations that go right through all the films, including Topsy Turvy and Mr. Turner. But on the other hand, what I like to do, and what we talk about and like to try and do, is to each time to make a different sort of film within the genre. So, I mean, I think Happy Go Lucky is as different from Naked as Topsy Turvy is actually from Mr. Turner. So I think it's important to kind of dish up a varied diet if you run a restaurant or any sort of eating establishment. And that's really what it's about. And we will make another film in a couple of years, and you can be quite sure, whatever it is, it'll be pretty different from Mr. Turner.
Question here, then here, then here, then here.
Hello, good morning. My name is Inger Merete Hobbelstam, representing Norwegian newspaper Dagbladet. Congratulations on the film, which I found very moving. It is, of course, about artistic expression, but also about emotional expression. It's about this man who has this amazing ability to express himself artistically, but there are also stories about loss and grief and people who've lost children, spouses, siblings, and so on. So a question for Ms. Lee, what did you think about this balance, or this tension, if you will, between the artistic expression and the expression of lived life, of emotions, of relations to other people? And I also like to direct that question to Mr. Spall and Ms. Bailey. How did you work on the scenes where they talk about or express their losses and their attempts to connect with other people anew? Thank you.
Do you want to go first?
Okay. I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is that life in that period, and my character, Mrs. Booth, who was a working class woman, she'd had a very tough life, and life was tough. You did lose children. In a way, we're very well looked after these days, but I wanted to depict someone who had ridden over the toughness of her life and not sunk underneath it, someone who had a spirit to survive and keep going. But that time in history was rough, and you had to be pretty tough to survive it. And she particularly lived by the sea, of course, and her previous husbands had both been mariners who had seen very dark, tragic events, ships going down, the slaving that was going on at that time in that period. So there were dark times, and one of the things I love, just looking at the film objectively, is how the film slides from the Georgian era in England into the Victorian era, and all that was a much more repressed time, and people trying to be more respectable. The Georgian era wasn't really like that. I don't know how we worked through. Well, under Mike's guidance is how we worked the particular scenes involving those issues.
Yeah, I think Turner's. There's a character there's a massive lead role in this film that isn't in it, and that's Turner's mother. Now, Turner's mother was unfortunately, the word then was a lunatic. In all of its horrible consequences, she made him and his father's life a misery, it seems, and we chose to exploit that in rehearsing, particularly between Paul Jesson, who brilliantly plays my daddy, and I think that left a scar through Turner's heart, and it made him dysfunctional quite a lot with women. And when he went eventually to Margate in his later years and discovered this simple but wonderfully wholesome, beautiful woman of depth, it softened his soul. And I think, in a sense, it was a kind of a love. It wasn't a weird Oedipal thing. There was a warmth in her that had been lacking in his life. He'd got from his daddy, but he'd never had it from a woman. And he certainly didn't allow Madamsel to give it to him. So I think it loosened up his ability to discuss how he really felt. And it's her warmth that brought that out in him. And also, he went to school in Margate as a boy, as you see in the film, and he talks about the friends he lost there. And an interesting fact you might want to know is that that house that Mrs. Booth lived in, and they fell in love in, and they lived together in for a while, was exactly the same place in Margate where my mother lived for 12 years. It's such a coincidence. And I think that's how that happened. That's how it loosened him up. That's why they fell in love. He was able to express himself with her, where he'd kept a lot of this in through the agony of this pain that his mother gave him. And I think also, I think this nuclear fissure inside him, this pain, created this amazing art. It's all part of the same deal.
Do you have any thing to add to that?
Well, yes. Hannah was orphaned when she was 12 and experienced a lot of infant death within her family. And I think when she was taken on by Turner and Daddy, that was her family, and so any death within that was heartbreaking for her as well. And she just kind of, rather like Turner, kept all that suppressed and in. And probably it was going through her mind, a huge monologue to reach him, but she couldn't actually express herself. And I think that's a lot to do with death as well.
I can't remember the other part of your question.
Balancing these artistic expressions with emotional expressions.
Well, that was a question for me, wasn't it? Well, apart from anything else, I think I'm always concerned with these films, and this film is no exception, with what I suppose you could call the tension between opposites in our lives. The film, there's always a kind of dialectic in the film, which is about what we are, what we aspire to being, what we wish we'd been, the realities of life, our dreams. All of those things are always in tension with each other. Or as those of us, and there are plenty of us here who are old enough to remember what it was like when we were hippies, we talked a lot about the yin and the yang. That's what it's about, basically, I think. And I think that is the subject matter of the film, really, at that level.
We'll take just a few more questions. Over here. Who has it? Okay, here. Go ahead.
Kate Muir from The Times. I'd like to congratulate Mr. Spall on his fantastic performance. Could he say something about the art of grunting, which we haven't seen before?
Well,
So don't worry, it's only the Times.
Yeah, it's only the Times. Watch it. Well, I think the grunting grew in this organically out of this incredible, instinctive and emotional, autodidactic, intellectual man that had a zillion things to say, but never said it, so he encapsulated it in an imploded grunt. That's how he expresses himself a lot of the times, because he's got this burning thing inside him. So rather than say it, it's just because it's like, you know, when those people who sneeze, they make that funny noise. It goes like, that's what it is. It's like people who sneeze and redecorate the room have a wonderful time. But people who do that, they're repressing something that's quite pleasurable, and I think that's what it is. That's the art of the grunt.
Just a second, question here, then the gentleman here.
Hi, Vincent Dowd, BBC World Service Radio. Question very, very specifically for Marion. People won't know probably here that you're taking a couple of days off from the London stage where you're currently playing Her Majesty the Queen.
I am, yeah.
In a very good comedy. Watching your performance as Mrs. Booth, I was surprised to find there's kind of a bit of an overlap, because in both roles you brought a sort of warmth and a humanity, maybe surprisingly, and I wondered if that's what you were trying to bring out with Mrs. Booth, her warmth.
Yes, I mean, not a great deal is known about her. Some biographies vary in what they say about her. Some say she was sort of money-grabbing and beneath him. Others say she was warm and looked after him. So with Mike, we created a character that, yes, I was aware she was warm but tough, and I think she had a great instinctive understanding of his work, of Turner's work, although intellectually, of course, she wasn't from that world at all. But I think she kind of, on a level she could never have articulated, understood the artist in him as well as the man, and I think, as I depicted her, she had great sympathy for the man and felt very sorry for him, this driven artist in many ways, and took on the job of, she said to herself, yeah, I'm just going to look after him now. And yeah, I'm glad you say she was warm, because that was my intention. But tough and practical. She had to be, you know. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hello, this is Iqbal from Bangladesh. So my question is for Mr. Mike Leigh. As a director, you think you have some similarities with Mr. Turner? Do you think you have some similarities as a personality with Mr. Turner?
No.
Thank you.
Or to put it another way.
Just one. We'll take just one more. Go ahead.
Hello, let me just stand up. Hello, Mike. We're from BBC South East, actually. Just going to ask, we're in very glamorous Cannes. I wanted to ask about glamorous Margate. What was it about Margate that you think really appealed to Turner? And also, if you could mention, I know you've talked about it, why you didn't film in Margate. You filmed, I think, down near Plymouth instead.
I'm going to ask my producer to, because otherwise she'll get away without having said anything here, to talk about why we didn't film in Margate. I mean, the fact is, the light in that part of Kent is fantastic. And that, I mean, obviously Turner went there was sent there to school as a small boy, and thus came across the light. And it is extraordinary. I mean, it's there at the end of the estuary. It's across the water from France.
Magical light. It's
Well,
magical.
It's magical, and there is a direct quote. He said, "The light above Thanet, which is the Isle of Thanet where Margate is, which is the North Foreland of East Kent, is amongst the most beautiful in Europe." And he'd never been to the rest of the world, so he meant the world.
Do you want to say something about the light?
Yes, Georgina, I thought he was passing on the mic to you.
No, I mean, it's just about the light. Do you want to?
The quality of the light. We couldn't find Margate, obviously where Margate was, but that's for Georgina to say. So then after that, probably the best light in Britain is in Cornwall, where we filmed Margate. which is famously beautiful light, has attracted artists for generations. So we were blessed with the most wonderful, glorious weather when we were there, and every day it was just the most magical summer I ever experienced living in England.
Why didn't we go to Margate?
We didn't go to Margate because of the gallery that's in the situation there now. So it's completely, it's completely changed. And we quite simply found a beautiful location in Cornwall, so that's where we ended up.
It doesn't exist anymore.
No, Margate doesn't look anything like Margate did of the 1830s, 40s. Nothing like it. It's a shame because it's a lovely, great place.
Some people, this hasn't happened yet because the film has hardly been seen, but you know, some people who really know Margate will object to the fact that the Margate in the film really doesn't look anything like Margate, but this is our distillation of Margate, and I think it serves the needs of the film in a very appropriately real way.
On that note, I'm afraid our time is up. Thank you all very much for being here today.